I welcome all of you to tonight's webinar, the final one in our Sexuality and the Sacred series. Before I introduce our distinguished presenter, please bear with me for some announcements, typical announcements. So each webinar is being recorded and posted to the Spirit Alive YouTube channel. Again, it usually takes 48 to 72 hours for our Spirit Alive Tech Matthew to post the recording. So please be patient, and you can access the recordings by going to the Spirit Alive homepage, click the recordings button, and you will be taken to the YouTube page, and all the recordings remain on that page. And if you are joining us for the first time this evening, please know that all of the webinars that were part of this Sexuality and the Sacred series are posted there, so you can always go back and see them. If you have any audio trouble, you can click the CC letters, find it on your screen, depending if you have an iPad or a tablet, and you will be able to read along as our presenter speaks tonight. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or wherever it is on your screen, and Dr. Ford will answer as many questions as time allows at the end of his presentation. If you like our programming, then I ask you, as I always do, to show your support by donating online to Spirit Alive. So your support, along with the generous support of the Sisters of St. Joseph, makes our programming possible. Alternately, you can send a check to Spirit Alive, and our address is on the website. And finally, I want to remind you that registration for our winter spring programs opens on December 18th. You'll get a reminder shortly about that, but registration does open on December 18th. Now, I have the honor of introducing tonight's presenter, Dr. Craig Ford, who is joining us from De Pere, Wisconsin, where there is no snow, he told me, and where he is an assistant professor of theology and religious studies at St. Norbert College. Dr. Ford teaches courses in Christian ethics, race, gender and sexuality, and ecclesiology, and he also serves as the co-director for the Peace and Justice Interdisciplinary Minor. Craig is also an adjunct faculty member at the Institute for Black Catholic Studies at Xavier University in Louisiana, the nation's only Catholic, historically Black Catholic college university, where he teaches courses on Black theology and takes up topics in moral theology from a Black perspective. In the 5 years since completing his doctorate at Boston College in 2018, Craig has already amassed, and he's shy about this, an impressive CV. He is the author of numerous publications, both academic and popular. He's a sought-after speaker. Craig writes on topics at the intersection of queer theory, critical race theory, and the Catholic moral tradition. He is currently working on a book titled Works of Art, Sexuality, Gender, Race, and a New Theology of Embodiment, and is also editing a volume which will showcase perspectives on the future of theology told through the perspective of queer Catholic theologians of color. Professor Ford is the recipient of numerous honors for his service and scholarship. In 2022, he received the Catherine Mori Lacuna Award, which recognizes the author of the best essay in theology by a younger member of the Catholic Theology Society of America, which is the largest theological society in the world. So I'm really grateful to Craig for taking time out of his busy schedule, which is now filled up with end of the semester grading of papers and exams, and for giving us the opportunity to have him spend this evening with us and to enrich us all with his insights on non-binary love. So, Craig, it's all yours. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sister. Yes, I'm very shy when it comes to a 4 or 5 minute introduction. I really appreciate that, sister. And I am grateful for all of you who have tuned in. It reminds me a little bit of presenting during COVID. I remember when I would present to my screen and do a lot of this, hand motion and waving. And then I actually have like a neighbor on another window over there, and I wonder what they think I'm doing over here. But what I want to, let me get my slide up. That way you can see this. Okay. All right. My hope is that you are able to see this exact slide, which talks about non-binary love. So when Sister first wrote me, and she gave me this title, I initially looked at it and said, that could go so many directions. What I want to speak with you tonight is taking this notion of non-binary, which I'm focusing on the lives and love and experiences of people who identify as gender non-binary. And I want to talk about the love that they have to show and that they can and they do show to themselves, to other people with whom they're in intimate relationships, and then in this larger notion of society, building a society where non-binary people as well as all other people can flourish. And so that's the genesis of the title for this: non-binary love, self, other, and others. And what's just at the root of this for me is talking about the central conviction that sits at many of our Christian faith, which is the incarnation, right? In its doctrinal form, the incarnation tells us that God became human in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. But there are also interesting, more capacious theological derivatives that come from that. One of the ones that's my favorite and one that really draws me into the presentation tonight is the understanding that in the incarnation, when God becomes human, what that means is that our flesh and our bodies can be revelatory of the divine. And as I think about this in a time of Advent, where we're waiting for Christ's return and Christ coming among us, I think about the incarnation as a huge exclamation point on another central Christian conviction that may be closer to home for many of us, right? That each and every one of us is made in the image and likeness of God. And so in a way, I'm thinking about non-binary love within this central conviction that God blesses our bodies with the ability to be revelatory of God's own love and life. And that's exactly what it means to be created in the image of God, and what Jesus placed, as I said, an exclamation point on in his incarnation that we celebrate in about 2 weeks. As Sister mentioned, I tend to work in this area of queer theology. And one way to think about queer theology in a very simple sense is to say that queer theology names a convergence of reflections that seeks to ask how the lives and the loves of those who identify with or around the LGBTQ experience, where lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer, this experience, how these particular people, how LGBTQ plus people who are made in the image and likeness of God, and their struggles that they go through as a result of what they encounter in the world, are also revelatory of the divine. And so queer theology represents this reflection of God's love inflected in these bodies of these people. And when people do queer theology, what they try to do is try to show how God's light is shining through that, through them. So in the time that we have together this evening, I want to, if I'm successful tonight, is to set up a conversation that we all can have around this theology revealed by the lives and the loves of those who exist outside the gender binary that currently predominates. And these are the lives of gender non-binary persons. And I want to do so in a way that is meaningfully rooted in our Roman Catholic tradition of moral thinking, because I think that it's very common for us, especially when you just talk to people that you may talk casually to people about what they think about the relationship between Catholicism and LGBTQ plus identity. Many people will say that they're fundamentally antagonistic. But one of the convictions that I have as a moral theologian is that actually they're not antagonistic, and that there is a way for us to talk about the flourishing and affirmation of the lives that gender non-binary people live while also being rooted in this tradition. So I want to do that in 3 ways. And these 3 ways, again, using these headings, love of self, love of other, and love of others, I want to talk about first non-binary love of self, as talking about, in a theological key, something that is fundamental to the health and the well-being of gender non-binary people, and that is finding oneself and loving oneself. The journey that many LGBTQ plus people do, as well as in particular trans and gender non-binary people do, is find a way to love who they are. And I want to show how that love, that journey towards self-love, is actually constitutive of God's overall call for the virtuous life. And here I'm going to do some connecting between the natural law tradition that many people are maybe familiar with in Roman Catholic ethical thought, and then also the experience that gender non-binary people and trans people more broadly have. Then moving to love of other, I want to talk about how intimate relationships involving gender non-binary people allow us to reclaim fundamental theological convictions that actually have been obscured in the tradition. That when we talk about the love that people celebrate in the Roman Catholic Church, we tend to really celebrate a heteronormative understanding of love that includes man and woman only in a sacramental marriage. But actually, when we open our theological imaginations, we actually find not only ancient wisdom, but actually ways that are possible to envision God's own being in new ways because of the relationships and the being that gender, trans and gender non-binary people exhibit and bring to these relationships. And finally, I want to think about, and this will just be sort of gesturing, but thinking about love of others and how we can think about building coalitions that allow for changing the world based on the insights and the struggles and journeys that gender non-binary and trans people live. So those are the three things I hope to do tonight. What I want to begin with first are some definitions, just to make sure we're all on the same page. In some ways, especially in my classes, I find that my students are sometimes teaching me about how people identify by sexual orientation and by gender identity. So I want to provide just a few here that I hope can ground our conversation for the rest of the night. So first is the definition of a transgender person. I myself identify as a cisgender male, which means that I personally identify with the gender that was assigned to me when I was born. A trans person, a transgender person, is someone who does not identify themselves with the gender that they were assigned at birth. I think important to recognize here is that trans identity then is an umbrella term that can refer to a number of other identities, right? It talks about the origin of one's discomfort, but it doesn't tell you exactly where you're going to end up. So there are a number of people, trans people, who will transition, as we'll see, to another gender in the binary, right? And there are other people who do not transition to another destination on the binary. So typically, sometimes we often think about transgender people as people who go from man to woman or woman to man, right? And that becomes sort of a paradigm, but that's just one type of trans person. The second definition shows the rest of the spectrum of trans identity, which references a gender non-binary person. So a gender non-binary person is someone whose chosen gender identity does not resonate with the binary man and woman dominant classification. What you'll find if you look at an intro to gender studies book, or if you begin to have conversations with people who work within queer work more broadly, is that they will say that our imaginations about the way bodies come are really structured by this binary gender sex system, where we only see two options, man or woman, and we don't see anything else. A gender non-binary person says that their particular gender identity doesn't fit either man or woman, and it is something else. Many times people who are gender non-binary will also go by the label queer to talk about their gender identity, but what is always safest to do is simply to ask them, and they'll often tell you how they'd like to be referred. As a part of the journey that trans people make, and once again, this is thinking broadly to include both people who transition from man to woman, woman to man, but also people who identify outside of that spectrum. A common element to the experience of transgender people is the experience of gender dysphoria, which refers to the experiences of psychological distress, suicide, ideation, depression, anxiety that comes from this experience of gender incongruence. And the way doctors help us make sense of gender incongruence is simply to define it as feeling a mismatch, once again, between one's gender identity and the gender that one has been given. And so as trans people tend to get older, right, whether that's pre-adolescence, adolescence, or into adulthood, as these symptoms begin to appear, it places trans people at risk for a number of outcomes that we recognize as very negative in the world. But one thing that we have learned over time is that for many transgender people, the symptoms that are associated with gender dysphoria, like depression, anxiety, et cetera, right, are actually alleviated or relieved entirely through a process called transitioning. This is the last kind of definition I want to give, right? And when people transition, we have typically understood those transitions occurring in two different types. Some are reversible transitions. So these refer to practices, for example, as adopting different pronouns. So if someone goes from he to she or he to they, right? This is reversible, right? One can at any point go back to the pronouns to which one was affiliated before. Also reversible are things like cross-dressing, and in some cases, taking some drugs like puberty blockers, are called as puberty blockers, right? Some of these are reversible. And then there are irreversible interventions. And the paradigmatic irreversible intervention is gender confirmation surgery. So either top surgery, where someone is having some sort of operation done on their breast area, or bottom surgery, which generally involves their genitals in some way. So these definitions, I hope, lay the groundwork for what we'll do today. Right. I will typically use trans as this umbrella term, but I'll also use the term gender non-binary. So when you hear them, think of them as interchangeable largely. If anything comes up where it would be to exclusion of one or the other, I'll let you know. Okay. So with that, I want to begin to think about this non-binary love of self, but to begin with where we find ourselves located in the world of Catholic moral theology. As perhaps many of you will already know or have experienced, right, is that trans identity poses a number of problems within the Catholic moral tradition, specifically within the natural law tradition that the Catholic Church upholds. If you've been following the news, you probably have learned or heard about some of the ways that trans identity is being engaged by a number of dioceses. We're starting to see a number of documents come out of dioceses that restrict the movement and the possibilities for how transgender people can express themselves. I happen to live in a diocese where one of these documents is currently in force. We have already seen over the last decade people who are discovered in same-sex relationships, but also people who are discovered as trans being terminated from positions of employment within Catholic institutions, particularly Catholic primary and secondary schools. And all of these actions, which are causing outrage which is resulting in outrage by a number of people, is based in this theological problem that Roman Catholic moral theology has. And without going too deeply into these arguments, what I want to give you is sort of the upshot of them. If you had to describe the issue that official Roman Catholic theology takes with trans identity, it boils down to this: that interventions in gender identity are believed to constitute misuses of our freedom, right? And the reason why is because the way that God has created us, according to this official account, right? The way God has created us is to be born either as a male or female, who then has a destiny to become a man or woman, respectively. And so the reason why this is implicated in questions around natural law is that the natural law tends to address questions about what it means to talk about our nature as human beings. The idea is that if we live according to our nature as human beings, then we will thrive according to how God wants us to be. So in the official Catholic imagination, which is the term I tend to use, the official Catholic imagination is one that says that if you are a male, you're born a male, you're going to be a man. If you are born a female, you're going to be a woman. And that is the way that God made you by nature. That there is no valid reason for one to intervene in that identity. That's the upshot. What you'll find also is that this observation leads to two very primary, I think, convictions within official Catholic teaching. One is this notion of gender essentialism. So what we find, if this conviction that I just talked about before, that God creates us by nature as males or females destined to be men and women, and there's no crossing between the two, the belief that you will often see when you turn to official documents is this notion of gender essentialism, right? And that essentially amplifies what we see as the problem here, right? That as human beings, we are either or, man or woman, and we have this destiny that is built into our own biology. This comes in very strong ways from the theology of John Paul II. But even perhaps more familiar to many of us is this notion of gender complementarity. And this second conviction is also of crucial importance for why the official Catholic imagination problematizes trans identity, because they believe that there's a reason why God creates only male and female who are destined to be man and woman respectively without crossover or transition in any way. The belief, and this is gender complementarity, is that the genders have almost a polarity where one is fulfilled by the other. And in the official Catholic imagination, this fulfillment of one gender by the other, this complementarity, is one that is evidenced by a number of what are taken to be psychological behaviors. If you've ever thought of or heard the saying, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, this sort of complementary psychological disposition where men have tendency to some roles, women have tendencies towards other roles, that is seen as complementary. But I think the example that is probably the most prominent that is meant to show evidence for this view, right, is that physiologically, male and female have this complementary role in sexual reproduction as we know it so far. The reason why I go through these terms is because I think that it helps clarify exactly what sort of interventions we are calling for if we're trying to think alongside LGBTQ plus people. So if we're looking at theologies that seek to affirm homosexuality, right, then what we'll have to do is generate arguments that try to show weaknesses within gender complementarity, right? That it's not just male and female that exhibit a complementarity, right? But if you follow the thoughts of moral theologians Todd Salzman and Michael Lawler, there is an entire personal complementarity that really matters, not just gender. Gender might be irrelevant to that, right? So you're going to take a critical look at gender complementarity. But if one wants to generate gender affirming theologies that affirm the existence of trans and gender non-binary people, then the arguments that you're going to want to produce try to make gender essentialism weaker, to try to show that this sort of ironclad relationship between male and man and female and woman, that almost you can look at someone's genitals and tell their future in their gender identity, you have to find ways to poke arguments at that. And part of my work over the last 5 years, as someone who is not trans, but is very sympathetic, I hope, to the experiences and certainly tries to be aware of the suffering that trans people have undergone, as I've tried to show how trans experience actually provides a lens onto reversing some of what we hear when we talk about gender essentialism in the official Catholic imagination. So how does one do that? One simple way that I'd like to talk to you about tonight is turning the experience of trans people and asking them what their experience of coming into the gender identity that they believe themselves to have is like. So when you talk to trans people, but I think also, especially when you talk to Christian trans people, what they will say is gender is something that they experience as a calling, almost as if one day when they have awakened to the types of embodiment that they believe they're called to, it almost sounds to them from across a distance where God is calling them, asking them to enter into this deep and arduous journey that may or may not lead to a number of difficult situations. And what I think is very significant about this call is that from a moral perspective, the entirety of the moral life is a call. When we think about, for example, the stories of Jesus's encounter with people who would become his future friends and disciples, it all begins with this encounter with a call, right? St. Matthew is imagined as like sitting behind a desk, and then Jesus comes and says, do you want to follow me? And sometimes I'm sitting behind my desk, especially during finals week. I hope Jesus would come and I would follow him in a heartbeat, right? I think this call, this echo, this invitation that Jesus offers is actually at the root of the entirety of the Christian moral life. And I think that's significant, right? If trans people are going to call their gender identity alignment a calling, that is significant for Catholics because in Catholic moral theology, the way that God is calling us is to a life marked by love of God and love of neighbor. And the way this has been parsed out in the Catholic tradition is to talk about a life of virtue. I promised myself, well, actually, I promised myself to try to keep the Thomas Aquinas to a low level. Number one, because I think a lot of people quote Thomas way too much. But I did my dissertation on Thomas. And one of the things I think is really helpful about the language that Thomas Aquinas uses is that when he says that God calls us to the virtuous life, what that means is that the life that God wants to offer us in Jesus Christ is an offer that actually allows us to become the best versions of ourselves. And virtues tend to be seen as these perfections of character. So I like to think about call and call as virtue and gender as calling as an interesting connection point. Because what it seems to me to indicate is that one can conceive of gender identity acquisition along lines similar to virtue acquisition, right? So let me explain that one more time. So the way Thomas Aquinas has tended to talk about the life that God offers us through God's grace is to say that God wants us to be the perfect version of ourselves. And what are the nutrients, what are the things that allow for us to become the best version of ourselves? Those things are the virtues. And in the history of the Catholic virtue tradition, we've typically not thought of our bodies or our embodiment as subject to this virtuous call. But I believe what trans and gender non-binary people are showing us is that maybe our understanding of the virtuous life has been too narrow. So let me explain a little bit more about what that might look like. So when Thomas Aquinas is doing his explanations of why virtue is important for the moral life, he borrows something from another very dead person called Aristotle. And he talks about how virtue is this mean between two vices, right? So one way to visualize that is to say you have virtue in the middle, and then you have vice on the one hand, vice of maybe deficiency, and then vice on the other hand as a vice of excess. Now, my favorite example is to talk about driving when I used to drive on the East Coast when there are a lot of cars on the road. So think about this virtue, courage. Okay. What makes someone courageous is that this person is able to withstand adversarial events with poise. But there are two things that are problems for courage, right? One is cowardice, right? So if I am working on courage, perhaps I'm disposed to cowardice, right? So if someone is trying to become a courageous person and they find themselves fearing a lot an opportunity to make their way through something difficult, right? That is going to be a deficiency of courage. And what that person will do in the moral life is try to get towards that center, right? That is not my vice. I have the other vice. So the other vice at the other end is rashness, right? If you sit in the highway and anyone crosses you in the wrong way and you immediately yell at them and think all sorts of wrong things about them, you're probably also joining me on the rashness boat. So just know I understand you, right? The rashness side is someone who goes headlong into something that might be dangerous, or goes headlong into something that is inadvisable. It has too little, I guess you could almost say too little of a check on their behavior. So if you're disposed to rash behavior, you have to dial that back in so that you can persevere through the right things that are difficult and not just through everything that happens to upset you, right? So Thomas, borrowing this from Aristotle and some of his in his work, says that the moral life that God offers us is like this. We find ourselves one day, and when we do a moral inventory of our lives, we might say, oh, I'm not the most just person, right? Or I'm not the most temperate person, right? Temperance is also another wonderful virtue you can put here, because if you're intemperate, which it's always odd enough to talk about after Thanksgiving, but if you happen to enjoy all those desserts, you might have to dial it back a little bit. And Thomas says that's a part of what God wants us to do to perfect ourselves. God wants us to be able to consume well, to persevere in what's difficult. Another virtue is prudence, right? Being able to think rightly about things to be done. And Thomas says the best way to conceptualize that is to think about the virtuous life as sitting between these two extremes and trying to bring yourself to the middle, right? So there might be some people, right, who are more prone to cowardice, more people concerned to rashness. But at the end of the day, the goal is to all of us be towards the middle. I believe that I've tried to argue this in my work over a few years, one of the things that trans and gender non-binary people show us is that their own lives are themselves, when it comes to thinking about their gender, live between, is a virtue that they're trying to achieve between two extremes. And the virtue that I place here, I've argued here, is called the virtue of alignment, right? When we think about someone who is trans or gender non-binary, and they've started to experience gender incongruence or gender dysphoria, they're coming to this judgment that their gender is not in alignment. On the one hand, potentially what that gender alignment looks like is gender dysphoria, right? That the gender that they experience themselves as having is not the one that's been given to them. And so transitioning brings them into alignment, right? The excess of that, and I think this is something that many people who are maybe cisgender tend not to think enough about, and when we have to bring our gender identities into alignment, is what I call the vice of naturalization, right? One of the things that our feminist foremothers and leaders have taught us, right, is that it is possible to be so unreflective about gender identity and gender norms that we can reproduce oppressive ways of thinking and being simply by acting the way we've been taught. When we naturalize the gender binary and just say that this is the way it is, and we don't think about how that gender binary operates in society, where that almost becomes invisible to us, gender has been completely naturalized. And that is a vice. That is a vice because if you happen to not be aware of how one's gender can socially reverberate in the world, then one becomes liable to using one's gender in a way that is problematic. And so bringing it into alignment, thinking about gender, right, is what's going to help. Thinking critically about one's gender identity is going to help you perfect yourself, right? So someone who is trans and gender non-binary may find themselves living in a dysphoric reality, and so trying to bring their gender into alignment via transitioning is what they do. People who are cisgender may find that their gender identity is one that is captured by an unthinking sedimentation, right? Just this is the way it is, and don't think about the social ramifications of gender. Particularly, this is a problem I think also for men. We have to bring that back into alignment. And so when we think about this gender journey towards the virtue of alignment as part of what it means to respond to God as a calling, I think we get a way to conceptualize in our moral theological framework the journeys that gender non-binary and trans people make as actually a part of the life that God is offering us, this life that allows us to be the best version of ourselves. Because that's exactly what the Catholic tradition, all the way from Augustine through Aquinas through the present day, has been talking about, right? For the gender non-binary person, the process of coming to love oneself and find oneself can be part of a God-given process that allows for human flourishing to begin to take root. And that, in a Catholic moral theological imagination, is what the call of Jesus is about. It's the reason why Jesus reached out to Matthew behind his desk and said, "Come and follow me." It's the reason why Jesus went out and said, "Hey, if you want to become fishers of people with me, follow me." And it's the reason why I think so many of us choose to follow Jesus in our own lives, because God is offering us a call to become the best versions of ourselves if we accept God's help in the process. For trans Christians and gender non-binary Christians, part of that offer is coming into alignment with one's own gender. And a sign, I think, of that alignment happening and being truly part of God's journey is when you start to see well-being, right? One of the things that what we've noticed is when people encounter Jesus in the Gospels is that Jesus offers them healing, right? When people say, "Rabbi, help me," Jesus says, "If you believe, your faith can heal, your faith can make you well." Many of us who are Christians, experience that in whatever area of our life that a virtue is supposed to help, right? Whatever it is that Christ is helping us with, that becomes a part of becoming the best version of ourselves. That's part of what God's call is. Same thing for trans people, right? We may find ourselves as cisgender people being healed from all sorts of maladies, or healed from all sorts of tendencies that are unhealthy or disfavorable to us as a result of walking with Christ. One of the signs for trans and gender non-binary people is that coming into accepting that call, accepting the healing that Christ is offering in these encounters in the Gospels, is that dysphoria, that incongruence, it goes away. And I think that is one of the key insights, right? If trans and gender non-binary Christians think about what God is calling them to, or their gender identity as a calling, and the Christian life has thought about the virtuous life as a calling in of itself, when you see people being healed from whatever binds them, that's a sign that God's working in their lives. When we see gender non-binary and trans people being healed as a result of transitioning, that also is a sign of God's work in their life. So that is the first part of what I want to talk about, right? How non-binary persons coming to love themselves and loving who they are actually can be constituted and be integrated into a Catholic account of what it means to flourish as people. The second thing I want to talk about is non-binary love of other. And for this, I want to jump a little bit ahead. If you have an image of a Bible in front of you, right, and I've been kind of hanging out in the Gospels, where I want to go now is towards the book of Ephesians. So towards the end of the 1st century CE, the church is beginning to expand in Asia Minor and in the Near East and in North Africa to a certain extent. And Christians are trying to figure out how they're supposed to live together. And so as moral theologians are wont to do, we have advice for everyone. And the person writing the letter to the church in Ephesus, had a lot of advice for them. When we think about love, once again, love is this image I want to play with, right? Love of not just self, but intimate partnership with other people. The Catholic imagination, especially the official Catholic imagination, is taken by this idea of marriage. And of course, many of us may know that marriage is understood to be this lifelong union between a man and a woman alone. That's how it's articulated in the official Catholic imagination, right? And it's quite obvious in this framing that there is a binary account of gender that's operative. So you have, once again, that view of gender that comes out of John Paul II, that gender essentialism and gender complementarity that's present in this official teaching. And the reason why I want us to turn to Ephesians is because when you look at Ephesians chapter 5, you will see the following words. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her in order to make her holy by cleansing her with the washing of water by the word, so as to present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or anything of the kind, so that she may be holy and without blemish. For this reason, man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. this is a great mystery, but I, and this person is writing in the name of Paul the Apostle, I'm speaking about Christ and the church. So the reason why I quote this is because when you talk to people about gender complementarity and you talk to them about, or at least the people I talk to, maybe you talk to people who have more pleasant conversations. But when you're talking about gender complementarity, you're talking about gender essentialism, one of the things that gets brought up is, well, marriage. That God's plan for the genders, the complementary and essential nature of the genders, is that they are fulfilled in one another, and that fulfillment is a marriage. And like God's own creation that erupts in fruitfulness, so does this union between a man and a woman, especially when they reproduce sexually, result in new life. There's this beautiful image that's constructed here, right? And so you kind of have this account where everything fits together. Like, why are we created as either man and woman in a gender essentialist account? Why is gender complementarity ordained by God? It's because it fits into this ostensibly beautiful picture where, in the same way that God, as a Trinitarian God, creates, so do human beings sharing in that Trinitarian image also create. And the church itself is this place of recreation, right? And there's new sons and daughters that then find themselves fulfilled by Christ in the world hereafter. There's a way in which this picture is very romantic and very beautiful, and it's very seductive. But I want you to pay attention to, in this passage, how gender is functioning, right? Because if you look at this passage and you begin to just think about this imagination, this image I put in front of your head, this seductive view, what you'll start to see is, once again, the lack of trans and gender non-binary people. In fact, Christ is gendered in Ephesians 5 in this passage as a man, and the church is gendered as a woman. Many of us probably are not surprised by this. When many people talk about the church is typically referred to with female and woman imagery. And what this argument wants you to believe is that the anchor for why men and women get married together in a lifelong union is because Christ is married to the church, right? So what's foundational here is that Christ is married to the church. Christ's image is male, church's image is female, and that as human beings, we reflect that relationship. Man on the one hand, husband, wife on the other, right? But the anchor is in heaven, as it were, and we are trying to imitate that on earth below. I think there are two very crucial mistakes here, though, that interrupt this romantic image, and I think allows us to rethink the image in a more adequate way that actually shows us why trans and gender non-binary people give us a better and more complete understanding of God and God's relationship to the church. First, and this is something that is not mine, but is something I learned from many of my feminist teachers throughout time, right? Christ is not a gender. Christ is a title, right? Feminist theologians have been telling us this forever. Theologians like Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, famous theologians like Elizabeth Johnson, formerly of Fordham University, right? She's now emerita faculty, right? What these thinkers, these brilliant women have shown us is that when we think about Christ, right? Christ actually is a title meaning the anointed one, right? When we think about the second person of the Trinity, that person that becomes Jesus, that person is not always gendered as a man, right? Though when Christ in the incarnation takes on the form of a man, which we obviously are celebrating in a few weeks, right? We know that is to be the case, but that person, when we look throughout Scripture and we look at how even the second person of the Trinity refers to themselves as the Word, that this Word was with God, we actually see a number of gendered renderings of this word that are not masculine, right? So one of the things that we notice a lot, particularly in the book of Proverbs, book of Ecclesiastes, and other places, is that the word that's described as being with God and being close to God is understood to be wisdom, Sophia, which is actually gendered as a woman, right? So that this second person in the Trinity that is incarnated in Jesus of Nazareth, right, that we celebrate at Christmas, that person exists in a mode that is beyond gender, both genders. One of the things I think is very interesting is that if you look at this from the perspective of gender, what happens to the second person, second person of the Trinity, the incarnation, is that they actually transition into a man, right? That what we see from the second person of the Trinity becoming human is a transitioning, right? And that the incarnation could be seen as a being that is beyond gender altogether, becoming a particular gender, right? That we come to recognize more readily in our society. That is what happened in the incarnation. But either way, the mistake that's being placed here is that Christ is not a man. Christ is a title, and that title refers to a person, the Trinity, that is beyond gender altogether, that doesn't fit on the gender binary. You may be seeing where I'm going with this, right? That's the first mistake. The first mistake is that by imagining Christ as a man, we actually substitute Jesus for a reality that is much greater than Jesus of Nazareth, the second person. That person is the second person of the Trinity that, when we look at Scripture, is referred to in many gendered ways. The second mistake is that imagining the church as a woman takes a lot of effort, because in it you have to erase all of the people of all the many genders that are represented within the church, right? When I look at my church, I see genders all plenty. I don't just see one gender. I just don't see women, right? I end up using this image of a woman, and I end up canceling out a lot of what I see to get this specific image, right? But what I see when I take the image of church more literally, or less metaphorically, or less restrictively, what does it mean to say that Christ is married to the church, that Christ is married to millions of people worldwide, that Christ is in this intimate relationship with all of us, living within us, right? That, to me, stretches this notion of marriage, because marriage is typically only seen as involving two people, but Christ is obviously married, so to speak, to a large number. So a way to visualize this is that we tend to read Ephesians 5 as saying Christ, church, and then that almost flows downward into husband and wife, and that's the way we read Ephesians 5. But what we're doing with these two crucial mistakes is what we're actually doing is imposing our concept of man and woman, which we are more familiar with, and we are, so to speak, imposing them upward. So rather than the analogy moving downward from heaven to earth, instead, what I think we're doing is changing that completely around by actually saying that we are going to use the title of man to limit how Christ appears. And we're using the woman to limit the manifestation of the church, that we're using this gender binary and imposing it on top of what it might mean for Christ to be in relationship with the church. So the anchor for the analogy is not Christ and the church. The anchor for the analogy is actually our binary notion of gender that we then project into God. But this, and this is something the ancient church taught us, is a big mistake. That to actually impose a category onto God, whether that's man, whether that's woman, whether there's any term adjective that we choose, is essentially going to be limiting, because God is beyond all of that. The Trinity is beyond all of these gender categories and boxes that we might try to put God into. And this is one of the central insights of the ancient church. And it comes to us in part famously through a guy named Pseudo-Dionysius. And what Pseudo-Dionysius counsels, and I think it's worth reading this passage. This passage is pretty old, translated, but it's from the Divine Names. And what he says is, if we want to actually talk about God accurately, then we have to say we really don't know God in his nature. He uses he, right? But it means God's nature, right? Since this is unknowable and beyond the reach of mind or of our reason. But we know God from the arrangement of everything, because everything is, in a sense, projected out from God. I think this one excerpt has such tremendous insight or how we might think of how gender non-binary people allow us to recover a central insight, not only into God, but how we might then organize our world and organize our society if we took that seriously, right? So notice that on the first hand, and on the one hand, he says, it's accurate to say that we can't know who God is in God's own nature. And that makes a lot of sense because God is beyond this reality. God is the creator of all of it. God contains all of this, but isn't, in a sense, a part of it, right? But Dionysius affirms we can learn something about God from everything because everything, in a sense, is projected out from God. When we actually don't discount the existence of trans and gender non-binary people, what we actually discover is that they are a manifestation, this projection out from God that gives us insight into who God is. That when we actually restrict the analogy of what it means for Christ to love the church or for someone to love someone else along the lines of a gender binary, we end up erasing part of the richness of God's creation. And in fact, what we need to do is restore that richness, right? If we try to put God into our boxes and these identitarian markers, we end up impoverishing God. But what gender non-binary and trans people are showing us is that what God is in God's nature is a transient God, a God that moves from a genderless being to a specific gender and then returns back to heaven again, right? As the one who has these wounds in his hands, right? And that becomes present to us every time we celebrate the Eucharist. Like, what does that mean for someone to trans themselves from someone living in heaven to being sacramentally present in the bread and the wine that we take at Mass? What does that mean? What sort of gender, what sort of being is capable of that, right? When we use just man and woman and these pronouns that are so limiting, we actually destroy our imagination about how great God actually is. But when we place non-binary and trans people directly into the spotlight of our theorizing, our theologizing, what we see is a richer and much more mosaic picture of who God is. That God is both man and woman, between and beyond, and that is actually theologically more accurate. And so the existence and the loves, what it might mean to be in a deep loving relationship with a gender non-binary person is that just like every person in intimate relationship finds their spouse as revealing something of God to them, right? So in some sense, in some way, at least in some part, a gender non-binary and trans person reveals a different side of God, a God that is beyond gender altogether, and more to the point, is actually theologically more fruitful than just limiting God to Christ as a man and the church as a woman. Okay. So in this final movement, thinking about not just love of self as being theologically significant of this journey, this offer, this call that God is offering us, especially through the experience of gender non-binary people. Not just thinking about the intimate loves and the relationships that trans and gender non-binary people have as also revelatory of who God is. We also may want to think about what this means for creating a different world. And so in this slide, because I know I want to finish up by the half hour, right? I just want to begin to hint at some of these things. And then I invite us to use this maybe potentially as a hinge for our own conversation. If we take the experience of trans and gender non-binary people seriously, it means that we have to begin to question, and this is what I said at the beginning of the talk, we have to question gender essentialism. This idea that one is born a male and that leads inevitably to being a man, and that one is born a female and that inevitably leads to being a woman. We have this obsession in our culture with determining sex by gender by looking at genitalia. Recognizing that what the existence of trans people and gender non-binary people reveal to us is that sex is not transparent to gender, right? In fact, if we look at even the category of sex alone, the binary classification of male and female is not sufficient to comprise the diversity of God's actual creation. That there are people who identify as intersex, right? And that their bodies present a different way of being in the world that we don't want to cancel out, because when we do that, we end up violating the one thing, one of the few things the ancient church leaves us, I think, is really, really, really valuable when we think about God, right? That everything reveals something of God. And when we cancel it out in our theorizing, we end up canceling out something about a way we can understand God. Sex is not transparent to gender is an insight that I think we need to begin to promote and try to internalize and try to think about, because when we do that, what we learn is something that the scientists are teaching us, that when we look at sexual, like sex identity among non-human creatures, it doesn't always add up to the way we like to think of it. One of my favorite examples I give in class is just looking at seahorses, where actually the male seahorses are the ones to actually become pregnant and gestate the young, right? That is a completely different way of thinking about the relationship between sex and gender, right? Clownfish go through a number of transitions in their lives, right? And that is a part of the tapestry of God's creation. Do we just cancel that when we think about human beings? What impoverishing is being done? How do we begin to ask for curriculum in our schools that actually help us understand what the state of the science is, right? Second point, moving beyond thinking about how sex and gender come apart in many people's experience, right, is thinking of our social life in denser terms, right? So I tried to offer earlier that continuum that talked about virtue of alignment in the center, and then there was dysphoria on one side, and then there was naturalization on the other, right? The reason why people are gender dysphoric, or why their gender becomes naturalized, is because of how the forces of our socialization interact on them, right? Because we don't accept trans people and gender non-binary people for who they are, what happens to them is that they want to oftentimes want to harm themselves more than other people, more than cisgender people for sure. They are more susceptible to depression and mental illness and other sorts of problems, right? And that is because we've constructed a society that makes that existence hard to live, right? In the same way, the forces that act on the naturalized gender, which is the other problematic manifestation, right, is that someone has so internalized those forces that they say, well, this is the only way to be, right? And so you have people who flippantly talk about this is what it means to be a man and this is what it means to be a woman, not recognizing that how we've understood what it means to be a man and a woman over time has been constructed by the society in which we live, right? What if we made it easier and advocated for ways in which people can see the calling that God is offering them, and that calling depends on the freedom to be able to follow that? How do we think about our workplaces, our schools, our churches, our spheres of influence, and begin to turn them into places where people can use their freedom to follow Christ's calling, to follow themselves into the healing that God is offering them, right? I think what makes this possible, and maybe this sounds a bit cliche, but I think it's actually very hard to be hopeful. I think if you watch the news, sometimes it's actually really hard to be hopeful. So hope is not for amateurs, but hope is actually foundational, because if we are going to build a society that doesn't settle for myths about sex and gender having a transparent correspondence, if we're going to be a type of society that does not settle for allowing trans and gender non-binary people to be at higher risk for harm and other negative outcomes, that's going to require that we actually model living in that world and practicing being in that world. And that is what hope enables us to do. The difference between hopeless and a hopeful existence is that you have a reason to try. And that trying, I think, comes from that conviction, right? That if we create this world, bring this world into being, what we are going to find is that it allows for God's many expressions, that Pseudo-Dionysius quote that was from the ancient church, to really take root, right? That actually when we do this work, we're allowing for God's creative light to shine even brighter. We're not suppressing, right? And it means that we're joining hands with the many, many people who have also been oppressed throughout history, who have practiced living in another world that they don't yet have, but that they are hoping comes into existence, right? We can enter into coalitions with these people, and that makes bringing that world, putting a lasso around that world and bringing it closer, it makes it even more possible. So I want to leave you with this quote here. This is from a book by a professor of African American studies named Marquise Bay. The title of the book is Black Trans Feminism. And what they write is this. They say coalitions recognize and make clear that, sure, perhaps there have been no identifiable moments in which Black or trans or femme or Black and trans and femme people have been unwaveringly free. But when you're a part of that coalition, the coalition persists. Black trans feminism and these other ways of being in the world that are seen as pushed to the side, they persist and they insist that, yes, we have never been free, but we have been being free. And what that being free means, if you're unsure what that means, you see being free in the face of every trans and every gender nonconforming person, in the face of every marginalized person whose life is marked by that flourishing, because despite the forces that exist in the world that force them into dysphoria, that force them into harm, that force them into hiding and fear, they have still somehow accepted Christ's call for healing in their lives, and so they love themselves. They've accepted that relationships with other people allows them to celebrate aspects of God's life and existence that go beyond simply the gender binary, right? And they show us that another world indeed is possible. Thank you very much.
Matthew, I think you're going to bring me back. Okay. All right. So that was wonderful, Craig. Thank you. A lot of energy. And we already have some questions. So let's take a look here. Of course, when will you be recording this and the last session be available? I think I said that at the beginning. It'll be available about 48 a Sunday or 72 hours. An attendee wants to know, how does gender essentialism deal with ambiguous genitalia?
Yeah. So in this official imagination and this dominant imagination, it's not just Catholics who have this view, but other people have this view as well. They'll say that, whenever you're trying to analyze something, you have dominant trends and then you have outliers. And so what a gender essentialist will say is, these are outliers, but really they're outliers because of some genetic defect, or so they're outliers for some other disorder in sexual development. And so essentially we don't have to pay attention to that difference. I think that once again, the problem with that view is that it erases people. It erases people because there's nothing wrong with their genitalia. There's nothing, like, it's not like they walk out with a cancer diagnosis and there's a problem. Like, they can live their whole lives with the genitalia that they have, which to me suggests that that's not a problem. Which I think to many other people who are trying to argue, especially people in the intersex community themselves, that there isn't a problem here. They're trying to say that you just have to expand beyond your dualistic view, and what you're actually going to find there is a way for everyone to thrive beyond just, the binary. Because what people used to do for intersex people, and if you are interested, I am happy to provide you with some resources on this. I mean, what doctors used to do is when they discovered a child with ambiguous genitalia, they would take it away from the mother and try to do a bit of an operation on it before the parents saw the child. Or maybe sometimes they would consult, but sometimes they would just do it. And this is, for some people, actually done irreparable physical harm. That's actually because of the surgeries that have been performed on them in infants, or at this moment of their birth or very soon thereafter. They've lost sensation in their genital area because of complications from these surgeries. So I think all this is speaking to the fact that gender essentialism may not be enough of a capacious enough framework to make sense of this reality.
Okay, good. Here's a comment, then a question.
Okay.
This writer says, I love your framework and perspective that provides a great argument for the absolute necessity of welcoming people in the LGBT plus community into the church. I am concerned about how to discuss this with conservative folks who think that folks who are trans or non-binary choose to be, or are influenced by others to be. So succumb to gender ideology. They don't believe the science that says that being trans or non-binary is biologically based and natural. How can we reach these folks and convince them that it's important for our organization, I don't know what that organization is, maybe the church, to be welcoming of people in the LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah. I think there's so many ways that one can approach this question. I think one that is helpful for me is I return to this notion of call and healing, right? That a sign, and this is not an infallible sign, but a sign that we are the way that God wants us to be is that we are flourishing. And if you look at the existence that trans and gender non-binary people have, when they are able to access care and be affirmed in who they are, we see a change. And that change is one that I think reflects the story of encountering Jesus in the Gospels, right? That if you want to judge a tree, look at its fruit. That's one other thing we find in the Gospels, right? If you see this work happening and people's lives are being changed in positive and healthy ways, right? Then that's probably a sign that that is the way God wants us to be, right? If you find people in perpetual psychological distress, right? That is not how God wants us to be. And I think that is a theologically significant sign, right? I think so that's one way to approach it, right? I think another angle to that question is asking God for the grace to be able to stay in relationship with people who are so resistant, right? In ways that we might interpret as very hurtful, right? Because I think that is also a calling that God might put on us. And I think even though it's very hard sometimes to stay in this relationship where there could be the possibility of change and conversion, sometimes you might be the one person that they actually are open to talking about this with. And I think that could be significant. And so on the one hand, right, I think we can ask ourselves from a moral perspective, if you see people living healthier lives, should we be that skeptical of it to think that God would not want them to live a healthy life, even when health is just understood as a physical index? The other one is asking about our spiritual lives and whether we can ask God for the grace to be able to stay at the table, even when it feels like there is this profound force that is pushing us and people who we love out.
Yeah. And this person, same person, says, to follow up on the previous question, he says, or she, the conservatives I want to engage in conversation reject the idea that gender is a social construct and would probably not think that naturalization would be a vice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, you might get a laugh out of this question, but I mean, Pope Francis, not perfect on gender, certainly not perfect on gender, acknowledges that there is a social component to gender. He does this in Amoris Laetitia, right? I think it's important to recognize that to say that gender is not socially constructed is to, I don't know, it's almost to look at the moon and say it doesn't exist. Like we're at the point in time where this is just not, like at this point, like your head is in the sand. Even people who are defending the official position don't argue that gender is not a social construct. So one person like this, her name is Abigail Favale. She teaches at Notre Dame. You can find her book, Genesis of Gender. She even knows, and she and I disagree on everything. She even knows that gender is a construct, right? And what she means by that is that, yes, there's a social component to gender, but she wants to say that there is this basis in how God created us that can never be crossed. I think that's up for debate. But I think what is not up for debate anymore is that there is a social component to how gender works. I mean, if you just turn on your computer and look at images of people around the world, gender is clearly constructed. And I think at this point, if people are going to deny that, you may have to have a more basic conversation with them. Like, do you accept what is going on in social science? And that even there are people who would defend that conservative position who are no longer defending the position that gender is not a social construct.
That's great. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I'd like to make a comment. Well, we have another question before I do that. Let me just get to this question. Dr. Ford, I am fortunate to have heard you speak on this topic many times. And just to make a comment on the wonderful term you also use, accompaniment of all our LGBT plus community, you're a treasure. Great compliment. Thank you, Monica.
Yeah, Monica and I are in the same ministry, so it's very nice to thank you, Monica, for that.
That's great. No, but what I'd like to comment on is this. I think, and this came up maybe last week, our last session with Christy Trina and that's a minute, I can't think of his name right now, Charlie. But I think one of the things that people have trouble with the most is the trans person, especially when the trans person does the irreversible, changing your body to become, I think, parents, grandparents, and we've had parents and grandparents joining us on this program, and they struggle with this. They struggle with this. I sometimes have great difficulty myself wrapping my head around it. I have never had anyone, and I'm very grateful to be instructed and persuaded and changed tonight by what you said. I've never had anybody speak about that in terms of alignment. That is the most beautiful, a very beautiful concept, because this is not the extremism that people sometimes attach to people who are transitioning. It's a movement towards, as you said, becoming the best person that God wants you to be, and in the best Roman Catholic tradition of Aquinas and so on. It is the pursuit of virtue. And if you think of it that way, that takes the whole mindset that people have, blows it up and turns it around from what is maybe dark and suspicious and not believing to seeing light and seeing what is beautiful and seeing potential. So I know I myself am extremely grateful for your presentation tonight. I wish we could see all of the people who were here on this webinar, 70 enrolled tonight, but many people sit with one or two other people and are watching this. So I want to thank you so much, Craig, for giving us your time tonight. And as we end this webinar series tonight, I would like to express thanks to all of you from across the U.S. who have joined this webinar series. We keep statistics, and I know that we have had people from, I think, 9 different countries and 40 states across the United States listening in. So wherever you are in the United States tonight, north, south, east to west, or on another continent, you are part of the Spirit Alive community, journeying together with us to understand more deeply the mystery of God, who Craig made very clear tonight is so much bigger than we can imagine. So with hearts opened and minds enlightened and renewed, let us give thanks for this series, and especially tonight for Craig. So good night, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the Advent season. May it be joyous. And before we close, let us be mindful again tonight of all the people who are suffering because of war and destruction and violence in their lives, especially the people in the Holy Land, in that place that Christ, the Prince of Peace, was born. So good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Good night, Craig.